really important to take away today is this focus on intersectionality. And when Kim was speaking today, I could barely contain myself in my chair. I couldn't tweet fast enough because she was going so fast and saying such brilliant things. But I've never heard that kind of critical reflection on multiraciality through the lens of intersectionality articulated so thoughtfully and eloquently. Two things came to mind as I was listening to Kim speak, and it's a direct reflection of the focus that you've decided on today, which I think, again, you deserve big kudos for. First is, mixed race identity does not exist outside its relationship with other existing identities. Fact. And the literature in mixed race studies has not done enough to make that truth a reality. Okay? Secondly, mixed race identity remains highly, highly regulated. Okay? So I think thinking about these two things in tandem is really important for us before we move forward. So I've written this totally academic talk, right? To talk a little bit about my book and da-da-da. I went over lunch and I ripped it and I said I'll have to start again because it's so rare to feel safe in a space to talk about our personal identities. And I've had a really hard week. I've come to Toronto for a funeral. I've had a family member pass away. And just being here has been so important for me. So I want to thank all of you for sharing your stories and being part of that journey with me. But I want to talk a little bit about my identity without making this kind of a focus on navel gazing. But I think it's important to talk about your identity in relationship to the issues that we've talked about today. But in particular, I also want to talk a little bit about my tortured relationship with the Academy, AKA the Ivory Tower, and I use that term very deliberately. Because I think a number of people have invoked the Academy today and are kind of complicit, tortured relationship with the Academy, and in particular thinking about what would a critical mixed race studies look like in Canada if it was incorporated and invigorated through our intellectual discussions. You know, we have some amazing people here today who are part of the conversation. We have Leanne Taylor from Brock, who does such exciting work on mixed race identity. Dan McNeil for Carleton as well is also here. So many extraordinary academics. Tamir Arviv is here, I see, who does extraordinary work on his PhD in geography. I really think we need to think about corralling all these voices and understanding how a more productive conversation in critical mixed race studies could emerge in Canada. So happy to have that conversation, talk about that a bit more. But let me talk a little bit about who I am and why I'm here today in terms of thinking through some of this. So I identify as an Indian, Iranian, Muslim woman who watches a lot of Scandal and Good Wife. I have a really kind of complicated relationship to mixed race identity. I've experienced, like many of you, a barrage of racial slurs, and the only thing that's ever stable about that is the instability, that I never know what racial slur I'm going to get. You name it, I've been called it. I had a knife pulled on me in Halifax when I was doing my PhD. I've been cornered on the street, called another racial slur. It's seemingly endless, right? And we all know about that. And I don't want to list off an inventory, as Diane Brand calls it, of my experiences of discrimination. I want to talk a little bit about my family's experience and how it led me to where I am today. So my parents met in England. My father was working in advertising. My mother was a Montessori teacher at the time. And of course they came to Canada because they heard about Trudeau's glorious new multicultural policy, and it might help them overcome some of the racism they thought they might face. They were already facing in England. They thought it might be better here. So you know the drill. A lot of us have this story. Our parents come here, and there aren't anybody who looks like them doesn't exist in Toronto at that time. My mom always says that if she saw another Indian person on the bus, they would go up and talk to that person on the bus, because it was so rare to see another Indian person. Now she says if that happened, she'd never get off the bus. She'd be too busy exchanging pleasantries with these people. But I do think that's really interesting to think about the time period and how that influenced their own personal trajectory. For me and my family, it's been a really complicated time in Canada. My dad experienced such vitriolic racism trying to get into advertising. I mean, really, my dad was like trying to become like the Don Draper, for those of you who watch Mad Men, of advertising. And he was told straight to his face, "I'm sorry, Kishan, you're just too Oriental to be a creative director." And you know, my dad used to tell me stories about sometimes at work he would go and crawl under his desk. And I remember thinking, that's how blatant white supremacy is within these institutions. You have to hide under your desk to escape that. And that's a really kind of powerful kind of metaphor for me when he told me that. For me, growing up, it's been also really complicated because my mother's side of the family showered a lot of disdain on me and my dad, obviously, in terms of Shadeism, in terms of my dad's Hindu faith. So I just refused to go to madrasa or to mosque because I'd rather just stay with my dad because I knew that they would just say horrible things about my father. Same thing when I was with my dad's side of the family. They thought my mother was just an Iranian terrorist, and why did they get married? Why did he get married to a Muslim in the first place? So very, very complicated experiences. And like I said, I don't want to linger on those stories too much, but I do think it illustrates the kinds of challenges that so many of us face in identifying as mixed. My name is also very complicated too. My name is Minelle, M-I-N-E-L-L-E, which loosely translated means wish come true in Arabic. It's supposed to be spelled M-A-N-A-L. A lot of you will know that's the traditional spelling, right? But actually what ended up happening is, of course, my parents came here and all they wanted was for their kids to integrate. So they said, what's a good French-Canadian name? Michelle. Maybe we'll change the spelling from Michelle to Minelle. So they were really hoping that people would think it's French. So that's really interesting to me too, thinking about the names that we choose for ourselves. And that's something I've spent a little bit of time talking and thinking through with other mixed race women is, why do we have these names? How do we shift our names over time? And how do we reclaim that part of our identity in order to reflect how we think about ourselves? And for me, it's been really important for me to make sure that my son has my last name, Mahtani, Indian last name. So he will know his roots. He'll know to be able to be identified as Indian in that way. So thinking about this idea of these different racial slurs that I've experienced, part of what I don't want to focus on is the woe is me, I've experienced so much racism. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm much more interested in asking larger questions, which is, what privilege emerges from that experience of racial ambiguity? Okay? Thinking about the fact that I actually have a lot of privilege coming from that perspective, and understanding how people see me as a racial ambassador, and how that's particularly problematic, right? What I call a kind of model minority who can effectively uphold the claims of the Canadian white settler state propped up through multiculturalism. And for me, that's really interesting. So why am I telling you all this? I think stories matter. I think histories matter. I think reflecting our own experiences matter, and we need to share those stories with other people and with the rest of the world. One of the things that I've done in my life history, I guess, is I used to be a former producer at the CBC, hence the context of the CBC. So that's how I have these connections. And working at the CBC, which is one of the most, it's like the bastion of white supremacy, if you've ever seen one before, right? And that's another story for another day, is thinking about how it is that we can tell different kinds of stories about people of mixed race in Canada. And I think that's really key. And I teach a course at U of T called Anti-Colonial Journalism. And it's really deliberately a focus on anti-colonial journalism. And by that, I mean, how can we develop anti-colonial ways of representing our worlds? Because we're not just truth tellers, we're sense makers. How do we make sense of our own experiences in the world? And that's really key. That is our responsibility as people who think, talk, understand about multiracial politics. How can we be sense makers of our experiences and share those stories authentically and in a genuine way that reflects our life experience? So fast forward, I start my undergraduate degree at U of T, get kicked out my first year. Terrible student, you know, they don't want me around, that's fine. So that's okay. I transfer over to Dalhousie in Nova Scotia somehow, thank God they took me. And this is the early 1990s. And I'm in sociology. I'm trained by a lot of white sociologists, white feminist sociologists. Again, 1990s, early identity politics, a really exciting time period. And what the white sociologists wanted to talk about, white feminist sociologists wanted to talk about, class. Class, class, class. Nothing wrong with talking about class, but let's not forget the kind of work that was really gaining traction in the academy at that time. Bell hooks, Audre Lorde, women of color critique, really, really crucial. But a lot of the white feminist sociologists and social scientists more broadly did not necessarily want to go into those spaces. So here I am reading all this work and trying to develop a different template for understanding my experiences. And I decided to take it upon myself to actually go into an even deeper place of white supremacy. I decided to start a PhD at University of London, okay, which is another complicated space in itself. So I get a grant to look at feminist experiences of mobility in the tube station in London. There could be an effective race critique in that analysis, but in writing up the grant application, that was not part of the project, right? And again, it's thinking about these processes of grant applications, what gets regulated and whose voices are heard. So I'm starting this PhD, I'm there in London, and I wake up in the middle of the night in the sweat. And I'm wondering what's going on. And I realize this is not what I want to do. This is not who I am. I know that I want to study people of mixed race in Canada. And at that point, I didn't even know there was even such a label of mixed race. I don't even know how the idea even popped up in my mind. But I decide, I'm going to go tell my supervisor I'm going to study mixed race identity instead. I walk into her office. She said, there's no way. I can't be your supervisor if you want to do this. So I'm watching my potential academic career fall to pieces here, but I know this is something I want to do. I walk into a bookstore the next day. Just so happens that 2 books by Maria Root, who a lot of you will know is a really important multiracial activist, is sitting on the freaking bookshelf. And I'm like, there is an academic conversation happening around multiraciality. So I'm getting really excited by this until I take a closer look at these books. And a lot of you will be familiar with Maria Root. She's an Asian white psychologist based in University of Washington, Seattle, who has written really, I think she's made important interventions into helping us understand multiraciality more broadly. In fact, I took it upon myself to use the last $200 that I had when I was at University of London to fly out to Seattle to go and meet with her to talk to her about my PhD, because I knew I wanted to do something on geography and mixed race women, but there were so few people for me to talk to about this kind of stuff. So it was exciting to see that there were academic works appearing, but A, they were American. There was really little happening in the Canadian context. Now, of course, that's changed. I'll talk about that in a minute. But there was very little happening in the Canadian context. Secondly, what was this focus on Asian white and Black white? What about a more fulsome, robust understanding about complex, racialized minority mixes as well? I couldn't figure out what place there was for me in this discourse as someone who was Indian, Iranian, Canadian. Could I identify as mixed race if I was of 2 minority mixes? And some would argue no. I did a postdoc down at Duke, and obviously it's very contentious to identify as mixed race the way that I identify here. And I think that's really important. One of the things that came up in my study of mixed race women is somebody shared with me a really potent metaphor. She said, fighting racism in the States is like punching a brick wall, but fighting it in Canada is like punching a marshmallow. It always melts back to the same shape. And I think we could say so many things about that metaphor, because I think it really illustrates the emptiness, the frothiness, the way that multiculturalism hijacks a kind of empty, shallow diversity, and how we really need to move beyond that. And that's why I'm so excited by what I've seen here today. Okay? Even though you got the grant from citizenship, immigration or whatever, even though you got that, it flies in the face of everything that Harper is trying to do right now, right? And that's important. We have to really think about where our loyalties lie, because one of the things that's come up for me today is making sure we remember the difference between our identities and our loyalties, right? Okay, really key. You can identify as mixed race and celebrate it. What I call mixed race anonymous. My name is Minelle Mahtani and I'm mixed race. Woohoo! Let's all sit down together and eat our spring rolls and talk about our difference. I think that's all great, but where your loyalties lie, one word: Baltimore. Think about what's happening. What I've heard today really challenges so much of the mixed race work that does not intervene in anti-Black racism. And in particular, too, I'm really interested in this idea of anti-indigeneity that so pervades a lot of the work in critical mixed race studies. Okay? Mixed race theory has not done enough at all to think about indigeneity in the current contemporary context. Chris Anderson out west has got a new book out called The Métis, and that really works to challenge that epistemic violence that we see in critical mixed race studies. But there needs to be more. And that's something I really tried to excavate in my book, this book, Mixed Race Amnesia, is to say we need an anti-colonial response to thinking about mixed race studies and mixed race more broadly in the popular context. I think that's really key. But also to take a long, hard, cold look at the way that journalists in this country are representing Indigenous people and how it props up a particularly problematic understanding of their experiences. So I'll give you an example of how I've seen this translated. A couple of things. One is, I actually, in the book, go through a particular story about mixed race people that appeared, I think, in 2007. So this reporter calls me up and he goes I'm going to do a big study, because this is what they like to do, right? This is so new, this is so different, as if this hasn't been happening for millions of years, right? But this is all new and different in Toronto, right? Toronto Life did this spread. Even today, as some of you probably saw the piece on the hyphen in the Star, I was just horrified, and we can talk about that later if you want. But in particular, I was really interested in the way this Toronto Star article on new Métis says, they're here, they're taking over, they're the new Métis. The new Métis, as opposed to who? Like the old Métis relegated to the dustbins of freaking history, right? We have a responsibility to think about our own complicit place upholding these kinds of binaries that work to oppress Indigenous people, okay? How many of us wrote in when that piece came out and said, this is really a shitty article? Sorry, I'm gonna swear too. Yeah, we need to take responsibility for that, right? The fact that this is a piece that was really problematic, like we need to cancel our subscriptions to the Star and recognize that we're not gonna accept this kind of coverage anymore, as Kim has already so beautifully articulated today. So I think that it's really interesting to think about some of these issues, particularly not just like the anti-Blackness of mixed race studies, but also the anti-Indigenous point of view as well. So what's so exciting about what I heard here today? I think we're moving into what I would call a second wave of critical mixed race understandings or popular kinds of discussions. This blows out of the water anything that I've heard at the critical mixed race studies conferences in Chicago. So this is what's happening, right? All of a sudden mixed race studies in academia is becoming a popular thing. So when I started this course 10 years ago at U of T, very few people were interested in it. Now, like, it's normally packed. People want to take this course, which is exciting on some levels, but I also think we have to interrogate why the excitement and why now, and think about that a bit more detail. So I really think that it's been important to challenge what I call the relentless negativity that has dogged the experience of mixed race people and the perceptions of multiraciality. It's been really key. Clearly, there's been a pervasive psychopathology that needed to be countered in mixed race studies, and people like Maria Root have done some really great work on that. But remember that it's really focused on the individual. Like Maria Root's Bill of Rights, it's very much, I have the right to decide how I'm going to call myself. And all those sorts of things are great, but there's no systemic analysis there, right? Thinking about how institutions work, thinking about organizations work, and thinking about how we need to challenge that on a much broader level. And part of what I'm really excited about today too, if you don't mind me plugging for a minute, is the students in my mixed race course, some of whom are here today, have produced an exhibit that tries to get at some of those complex global formations. And it's going to be part of the art show tonight, so I really want to encourage a lot of you to come out to think about and to take a look at that a little bit more. How am I doing for time? Okay, that's great. So part of what I think is really important for us to move forward, first is we have to challenge the black-white and Asian-white binary that so dominates literature and unpopular understandings of mixed race identity, while recognizing how powerful those binaries are. So how do we begin to get at some of that complexity? Okay. Secondly, I think we have to challenge the predominant way that we have privileged whiteness epistemologically in mixed race studies. So in thinking about whiteness and moving beyond that relationship of centering whiteness, how do we decenter whiteness and think more about indigeneity and Blackness, for example? I think that'll be another really important way to move forward. So how do we reimagine the place of non-white mixed race subjects in critical mixed race understandings? That's really key. Let me take you back to the Canadian context for a second. When I started writing about these issues, there was so little available to me to draw from. And this is, again, early 1990s. I mean, thank God for Carol Camper, right? Thank God. I mean, Miscegenation Blues was such an important anthology for all of us. For the first time, I felt recognized, that I felt known and understood. When I was doing my PhD in London, I remember breaking my pencil lead when I was taking notes in class. I'd been so angry at professors not recognizing race, not thinking about inequality in a particular way that understood racialized experiences. Camper's anthology really spoke to me. And people like Idebe and Andrea, who have done such important work in encouraging and extending those voices, really need to be, they deserve such congratulations for continuing that really important conversation. So thank you. Wherever you guys are, I think you're probably here, so I think that's really key. And then Lawrence Hill's book came out in the scene. Remember Blackberry Sweet Juice, when he was thinking about some of these issues? And I felt really fortunate. I had the joy of editing that book with Larry, and I learned so much from him as we were going through that particular, that edited process, and that was really exciting too. But there was still a lot more work to be done, and this is where I'm kind of at now, and in the book I tried to think about this. I want to know what work Canada does as a state, as a racial backdrop, as a formative geography to impact definitions of mixed race in the Canadian context. So that's what the book really tries to do, is to think about how Canadian multicultural policy as a practice and ideology intertwines complicitly with liberal multiculturalism. How do state-sanctioned policies influence how one is able to identify as mixed race in Canada versus the US and England, for example? And I've also just finished editing a book called Global Mixed Race, which on the surface, it's great. It's, I'm glad it's out there. But I'm not convinced it does enough to talk about those complex global racial formations and their interconnectedness. Again, something that I think Kim did a really beautiful job of talking about today. I also talk about this idea of the model multiracial. And I want to explain a little bit what I mean by that. This is a racially ambiguous mixed race person in Canada, someone who's seen as a chameleon. And again, I'm really wary of using these animal metaphors to describe us, but for these purposes today, I think you'll understand why I'm doing so. So the model multiracial is someone who is envisioned as forward-thinking. She's understood as a symbol of racial egalitarianism, which is reassuring for white Canadians, serving to perpetuate a historical, inaccurate vision of Canada as fair and equal. And this is something that really came through in a lot of the interviews I did with women of mixed race who said, well, I'm just the next model for what Canada is. I'm just a stew, a big Canadian stew. How do we make sense of those kinds of comments, right? That they actually see themselves as a model for what the Canadian nation state could be without being politically informed of the racial inequalities that underpin that understanding. So I think that's really key to begin to think about some of those things. So what I'm trying to do is think about the idea that we cannot speak of mixing in and of itself as positive or progressive, okay? It can distract us from more kind of precise forms of racial oppression, particularly among members of the most marginalized groups, particularly Blacks and Indigenous people. So I think that there's a lot of really good things happening, but we also need to interrogate the foundations on which critical mixed race theory rests. They are, unfortunately, racist, okay? They are unfortunately also heteronormative. Okay? And we've talked about that today, but I think we can go farther in terms of what we can do at the next conference, which is totally, I hope, is on the agenda. What I see is so much of mixed race studies governed by what I call a grammar of good intentions. Okay? It truly can be an illusion of inclusion. Okay? Okay? So I think we need to take a hard, cold, long look and think about how we're propping up racial inequalities. And again, a lot of this has a very particular history, which has led us to this particular place in time, right? Think about the fact that a lot of this arose from second wave feminism, white women's second wave feminism, right? The personal is political mantra, which was hijacked in many ways by white women, I think. Anyway, that's another story for another day. And people like Maria Root, right, whose work was steeped in psychology. She was very much steeped in an individualistic response to thinking about mixed race, and we need to think about systems more broadly. Okay? This demonstrates an intellectually weak liberal humanism. And I want to end by talking about what could be humane in a minute. Okay? So, secondly, anti-Black critique, like I've been talking about. W.E.B. Du Bois talks a lot about this idea in Souls of Black Folk about how does it feel to be a problem. So I want to flip that and think about asking you, how does it feel to be a solution? Right? And we're not that, right? We are not a solution. We've talked so much and grappled today with so many of these other issues, but we don't hold the promise of a post-racial future. We are not purveyors of a new racial order, and we need to remember how we can dissect that and really begin to pick it apart in such a way that people really begin to understand these racial inequalities more broadly. Lastly, methodologically, where do we go from here? Part of what I'm struggling with in my work, and I try to think about in my book, is how mixed race is really a product of strategic forgetting. That in identifying as mixed race, we often eclipse those very complex diasporic histories that make us who we are. And when Andrea was doing her poem today, I really felt, I was so moved. It's one thing to see in print, but to hear her talk about history and tracing back those paths to our ancestors, that's what we need to get at. And how do we begin to get there today? How might we begin to imagine what that could look like? So, to end, new questions. What are we going to do in terms of moving forward into what I call second wave of mixed race studies? What I've seen today, I think, is definitely the beginning, and it's very exciting to me. But I think we also need to ask some new questions. First, what does it mean, not just what does it mean to be mixed race, but how the meaning of mixed race changes over time and space. I'm a geographer, so of course that really matters to me. So it's not just a what, but also a when and where. And Dan McNeil, who I don't know if he's here right now, but he has, Dan McNeil at Carleton, who I think is a brilliant academic who's done some really important work on mixed race studies, MCNEIL. And yeah, do I have that right? Yeah, MCNEIL, yeah. Okay, so Dan has written some amazing work, but one of the things that he's been saying recently, it's not asking where are you from, but when are you from? He said this in Chicago in a panel that I organized in November, and I was like, wow, it totally blew my mind. So I think that's really important. And secondly, I want to advocate to all of you for the potential of thinking about a multiracial sense of place. Okay? I'm a geographer, so belonging really matters to me, and thinking about how do we feel at home, right? I think the only way we can do that is by unthinking our present geographical arrangements, right? To imagine a sense of place that is virtually impossible under contemporary Eurocentric geographical standards. Okay? We need a shift in imagination, moving beyond this idea of us as either confined and constrained or limitless and unstoppable, right? As we know, these are the kinds of descriptions that exist around our experience. I always think about June Jordan and her really powerful words. She says, there's power and then there's difference. And power decides the meaning of difference. And I really want to encourage us to think about that for a while. How does white supremacy and institutions and organizations decide the freight of mixed race studies? And I was thinking about that with your grant, right? How citizenship immigration decides whether or not our conference is worthy to be given money to be supported. So that's just one example. So how might we begin to dismantle white supremacy and its articulation through their reflection of what mixed race means to them, and how can we refuse those shackles? How might we move forward? So that's the first thing. We need to think about dismantling white supremacy, and again, Baltimore. I can't say it, and we can talk about that more later. But secondly, think about what you can do here. The networking possibilities here today are extraordinary. How might we work together to really think about a new way of understanding love and moving forward to develop a different discourse in mixed race studies? And lastly, I just want to say one thing about this mixed race sense of place in terms of new geographical framings. Previous framings have really positioned us as historically impossible existential nightmares, right? And that was a quote directly from one of the interviews I did for my book. It's up to us to come up with new cartographies. That is our responsibility, and we can do that. And today was just one example of the possibilities of what that could look like. And it's up to us to dare to imagine the potent possibilities for a more humane world. So thank you so much, Rima, again, for an extraordinary day. I'm honored to be here.